welcome to this video 2 for weeks 3 to 4 of Language Learning and Wellbeing, which is exploring substance use. This video is going to build on some of the things that we covered in video 1 and is going to think specifically about an approach to studying health discourse that is very popular and very common in terms of linguistic approaches, called conceptual metaphor theory. Now, this will be something that a few of you will have come across briefly in other aspects of your degree so far, and those of you who are taking Reading in the Mind next semester will focus in a lot more depth and detail on conceptual metaphor in that module. However, we're going to introduce it now. Before I continue, I just want to highlight that there is a brief section of this video which does engage with some of the work that you covered last week, some of you will have covered last week, to do with disordered eating. If you look below in the description of this video on the Blackboard site, there will be a timestamp as to where that discussion is, so if you would prefer to skip that small section of the video and just move on, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so let's start then with thinking about some of the ideas that we raised in video 1 and some of the exercises that you will have engaged with as part of the tasks associated with this week as well. So I just want you to pause the video for a moment and just consider these 4 questions. What does a drinker look like? What does a cocaine user look like? What about someone who takes MDMA? And what about a heroin addict? I'll just give you a few moments to have a think about the what, where and who of these 4 questions. Okay, so hopefully you've had a moment to think about that now. Now, I would like you to just take a moment to reflect on your answers, but also to just have a reflection on the phrasing of some of these questions, because very often the naming strategies that we use around different substances can tell us a lot about social attitudes towards them. So a drinker is something which is very sort of colloquial, quite informal, very common and very neutral phrase for somebody who consumes alcohol. A cocaine user, similarly, talks about the person as though they're an individual, and taking cocaine is something that they do. Similarly, with someone who takes MDMA, arguably this is even less judgmental, sort of a more neutral kind of term, that the person is separated from the thing that they do. But there's a bit of a contrast between this and a heroin addict, and I would imagine that most of you, if you were to reflect back on your answers to these 4 questions, of whatever characterisation you've had, that we could think about the heroin addict as probably being the least positive image. And this term addict is something that we're going to talk about in a lot of detail today. Now, in popular representations, we've talked a little bit on other parts of this week about fictional representations, but I would also say in popular conception, if you see articles, for example, about heroin use and heroin addiction, if you see articles about addiction, that heroin is particularly a drug which is characterised as being extremely bad for you, highly addictive, and portrayals of people who struggle with heroin tend to portray them as probably quite unclean, probably quite dirty, perhaps not taking very good care of themselves. And I think that there are some aspects of truth often to those representations because of the financial impact that a substance use issue to something as expensive and as addictive as heroin can have on somebody financially. But before we move on, I just want to show you these 2 images. This is Monteith and Seymour Hoffman, both very famous actors who both died as a result of heroin overdoses. And I really just wanted to show this to you at the start of the video, to get you to think about some of the things that we've been talking about, in particular in week 1 about human potential and human development, about where these physical, visible effects of substance problems actually come from. Because people were very, very surprised, and if you Google Monteith or Seymour Hoffman, people were extremely surprised, extremely upset. Nobody really knew in kind of popular media that either of them were struggling with heroin use. And I would suggest to you that one of the reasons for that was because they were both very wealthy and well-off individuals. They were able to continue their use of this substance without it having a financial impact on them such that it would cause it to manifest physically or visibly. So neither of them lost their homes, neither of them couldn't afford to buy clothes, neither of them couldn't afford to buy food. They were able to maintain a substance addiction, as well as continuing all of these other things. So just a useful thing, I think, for us to kick off with in really challenging and thinking about these things that we very prototypically associate with particularly severe substance addictions are often the product of circumstance rather than symptoms of the actual use of that substance itself. So just a useful thing to bear in mind. So last week, some of you will have read Olivia Knapton's fantastic research into eating disorders and pro-anorexia websites and anorexia specifically. And she, those of you who did read that, will be a little bit familiar already with the approach that I'm going to introduce you to now. So I just want to take a moment to draw a couple of parallels between that reading that I know some of you will have done and the stuff that we're going to look at today. So she was particularly interested in the conceptual metaphors that were associated with disordered eating. This is a very prevalent approach to studying language in general, but also specifically looking at health discourses and the language of various conditions, including both disordered eating and substance use and addiction. Like disordered eating and the findings that Knapton had in her research, substance use can be viewed on a spectrum from entirely acceptable and normalised behaviour to relationships with the substance that can be viewed as unhealthy or problematic. So in exactly the same way that Olivia Knapton in her article talks about the idea that the conceptual metaphors that people struggling with anorexia use to conceptualise their illness and to conceptualise their relationship with food and their behaviours are no different from those which are manifest in diet culture, in magazines. She suggests that people who struggle with anorexia don't get these conceptualizations from nowhere. All they really are is a more extreme form, a more extreme version of the same conceptualizations that are very prevalent in popular media. And in the same way, we could talk about substance use in exactly the same way. So recreational use of substances is in some contexts highly normalised and highly socially acceptable. It is only at points at which it transmutes into something like addiction and becomes something that we might more think more of as a medical problem, an extreme version of those exact same behaviours that are normalised and acceptable in other parts of society, that the way in which we talk about substance use changes. So at the extreme end of this, both relationships with food, exercise, or in the topic that we're looking at this week, substances, extend beyond being viewed as simply unhealthy and come to be pathologised. And pathologised is a term that has been mentioned once or twice on this module already. Pathologised simply means something being viewed as a diagnosable medical problem. So it is no longer something that a lifestyle choice or something that people engage with. It's something that has become a serious medical issue. So conceptual metaphor theory, then, I'm just going to take a few moments to introduce to you, and I'm going to treat this as though nobody has come across it before, because many people on this module haven't. Conceptual metaphor theory is the favoured approach to metaphor analysis within stylistics and cognitive linguistics. And really, its central claim is that metaphor is not something which only appears in poetry, that is an ornament, is something which is quite unusual, that is associated with highly creative language, that it's actually very, very central to our entire conceptual system and the way in which we make sense of ourselves and the world in which we live. So they suggest, Jeffries and McIntyre, and in particular Lakoff and Johnson, who were really the architects of this theory, they suggest that in fact all abstract things, we have to use metaphor in order to talk about, to explain and to understand these concepts. I'm going to give you an example of this in a moment. So metaphors, they suggest, are not just ornamental but central to the way in which we think. They are not just a figure of speech, they are actually a mode of thought. So according to conceptual metaphor theory, its very basic claims are that we make sense of more abstract and less familiar concepts, which are in this theory called targets, by drawing on more concrete, familiar domains of knowledge, which we call sources, through a process of conceptual mapping. Now, what that basically means is that we take something which we are very familiar with, that we interact with in the world, that we have a very clear sense and understanding of what it is, and then we draw on our knowledge of that in order to understand more abstract concepts, and that is a process of engaging metaphor, and that is a process of mapping from the concrete thing to the more abstract thing, our understanding, and that is the way in which we make sense of most things in the world around us. So this simply means that we take salient features, that means important features, relevant features, from whatever our source is, this more concrete thing, and apply them to help us understand and talk about the target. And I'm going to suggest to you that one of the reasons that this is very manifest in health discourse is because when we think about things like illness, when we think about things like addiction, these are very abstract concepts. You can't look at them and tangibly see what they are. So we have to use more concrete things in the world that we do interact with in order to understand them. And that's why we tend to draw on these more abstract, on these more concrete ideas to understand these more abstract concepts. And health discourse is very, very, very full of abstract concepts that require this kind of metaphorical language use in order for us to talk about them. So let me give you an example. So we've said that the target domain is the topic or the concept that you want to describe, and this is how we represent it whenever we're discussing conceptual metaphors in linguistic analysis. We use small capital letters, and the target will always be the thing that comes first. So in this example, we've got life. I'm going to give life as an example for you here. Now, life was a really good example to use as a target because it's something that we want to talk about all the time, but it's a very abstract concept. We then have the ISA, or if you're interested in this area, there are lots of other iterations that we might come across of what goes in this middle bit. And then afterwards we have the source. And I'm going to give you an example of a very, very common conceptual metaphor that is used, that's very, very manifest in all sorts of our everyday speech, of life is a journey. So journey in this context is our source. It's our more concrete thing, because journeys are things that we do every day. They're things that we're very, very familiar with. That as we move through the world, we go on journeys, we know what a journey is. So the suggestion of conceptual metaphor is that we take this thing, this source, in this case journey, as the thing that's more concrete, and we use it to take relevant bits out of it, to map onto something more abstract like life in order to talk about and make sense of it. So typical mappings in relation to life as a journey might include things like events being spatially situated. So we tend to conceptualize the future as being ahead of us and the past as being behind us. And if we think about that, the reason why we do that is because we are often engaging this conceptual metaphor of life as a journey, where you move forward to get to the end of the journey, and the bit of the journey that you've already done is behind you. So past events we tend to talk about spatially being behind us, and things that are going to happen in the future we tend to talk about being ahead of us, just as we would places we would be going on a journey, and places that we've been tend to be behind us. We tend to talk about choices as paths or roads. Again, if we think about a journey, there are often different options of routes that we can take, and we will talk about life choices in the same way. We might talk about passage of time as physical movement, so people will talk about being stuck in a rut, for example, as not moving, feeling like you're not moving forward in life. That is another invocation of life as a journey. It's a way of conceptualising life through this thing that we're very familiar with. We might talk about moving forwards with our lives, or wanting to move on. Again, a metaphorical construction of life as a journey, as something that we conceptualise that a journey is something that you progress forwards on, and in life we think about it in the same way. We might talk about challenges as obstacles. So when you encounter a physical obstacle on your journey, you have to navigate around or over it, or you might be forced to come to a stop. And we talk about things like facing hurdles or hitting a wall in life. These are ways in which we use journey to talk about life and the obstacles that the metaphorical obstacles that we have encountered. Similarly, we talk about life stages as journey stages, so we tend to conceptualise life as having a beginning, a middle and an end. And conceptual metaphor theory would argue that's because we are drawing on this source of journey in order to do that, because life is a very abstract thing, and journey is very concrete, and journeys have beginning, middles and ends, and because we're using our understanding of journey to make sense of this concept, life, that is the way in which we're conceptualising life, that comes reflected in our language choices. So let me give you a few more examples. I won't read through these, I'll just give you a moment to browse them. But all sorts of very, very common everyday phrases, all metaphors, and all have the same underlying conceptual metaphor within them, which is life as a journey. So I'll just give you a moment to browse those. So one reason why conceptual metaphor theory is a really useful way of approaching any sort of linguistic analysis is because how we conceive of things is something that we're often not consciously aware of. However, the language that we use when we talk about things often reveals the conceptual metaphors that we're drawing on. And because of that, by looking at how people talk and analysing their language choices, we can work out how they're conceptualizing a particular idea or a particular concept, like life, for example. So if you see somebody using these kinds of words and phrases, you can look and think, okay, well, this is quite interesting because they're talking about life, but what kind of source domain are they drawing on? It appears to be a journey, and that tells us something about how somebody is thinking about life. Now, often there will be multiple different possible sources that people could draw on, and the way in which they draw, the sources that they choose to draw on, will be reflected in their language choices, and those different conceptualizations will reflect different ways in which we see the world, and we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. So here's just a few examples. So I talked about life as a journey. Other common ones to do with life are things like life is a story, life is a day, life is a year. Very often conceptual metaphors exist as part of a binary, as part of a pair. So people will tend to conceptualise things that are good as being up and things that are bad as being down, because good and bad are vague and abstract concepts, but we all know what up and down are. Similarly, light and darkness, very, very common experiences, things that, every single day we tend to experience, periods when it is light and periods when it's dark, and often we will draw on these as very, very concrete source domains that we understand and that we're very familiar with to map onto these more abstract targets, good and bad. Now, when we think about addiction, again, another quite woolly, quite vague, quite abstract concept, it's interesting to look at two very distinct conceptualizations that different people have. The first of which is addiction is illness, and the second of which is addiction is choice. Now, depending on how people conceptualise addiction, that can have a really fundamental impact on how they feel about everything from how addicts should be treated, whether they should be respected, whether they should be in receipt of help, whether or not treatment for addiction should be available on the NHS. If you think that addiction is an illness, of course you would think it is something which requires and merits hospital treatment, because that's what we do with all illnesses. However, if you think it's a choice, and you think that somebody is just making personal life choices, lifestyle choices, and that they could stop being addicted to something anytime they wanted to, if they really wanted to, you may not think that they are worthy of help or worthy of being in receipt of National Health Service care. So two different conceptualizations, two different sources to understand the same target that can have a really, really profound and fundamental effect on how people think and talk about addiction. So let's look at a few examples of this now. So I'm just going to take a moment and play you a clip from Russell Brand talking to the Committee on Drugs down in Parliament. I'm going to play a few minutes of this, and I'm going to tell you before we start that Russell Brand is quite well known for being somebody who thinks about addiction as an illness. He conceptualises it as an illness. So I'm just going to play you a couple of minutes of this clip, and then we will have a look at a short excerpt from the transcript of what we've just watched. So as you watch this, try and listen to the particular words and phrases that Brand uses, and see if you can spot any indication of this conceptualization of addiction as illness. So what we're looking for are words and phrases that one might associate with illness, that he's mapping on to talking about addiction.
Drugs didn't help me much.
You're a former heroin addict.
Yeah.
Briefly, could you tell us how you got onto drugs and then how you managed to come off it and how many years you were on hard drugs?
I see you've incorporated the word briefly now into the question, as you've already noticed my propensity for verbosity. I became a drug addict, I think, because of emotional difficulties, psychological difficulties, and perhaps a spiritual malady. For me, taking drugs and excessive drinking were the result of a psychological, spiritual or mental condition. So they're symptomatic. I was like sad, lonely, unhappy, detached, and drugs and alcohol for me seemed like a solution to that problem. Once I dealt with the emotional, spiritual, mental impetus, I no longer felt the need to take drugs or use drugs. I got clean actually at Chip Summers' facility, Focus 12, which is abstinence-based recovery. And that's what we essentially believe in, is that if you have the disease or the illness of addiction or alcoholism, the best way to tackle it is to not use drugs in any form, whether it's state-sponsored opiates like methadone or illegal street drugs or illegal substance like alcohol. We see no distinction between these substances. What we believe in is that abstinence-based recovery is the best solution for people suffering from this condition, and the support structures exist to get people to maintain recovery, abstinence-based recovery. What we want is more research and funding into abstinence-based recovery, and to be able to filter people towards this new lifestyle, which actually criminalisation becomes less of an issue in my view, because it takes people that have to indulge in criminal activity to fund their habits and gets them into being valuable members of society. Now, was that brief enough?
Very brief, thank you. You were arrested roughly 12 times.
It was rough, yes.
By the police and the justice system. Do you think that when you were arrested that you had the kind of support that you needed, and people like you who were arrested being involved in drugs, the rehabilitation and the support that was needed to get you off drugs? How did the criminal justice system react to you after your arrests?
From my experience speaking to people in the criminal justice system, and from my own personal experience being arrested, there's some confusion and ignorance around addiction, and it's quite understandable because a lot of drug addicts, like speaking personally, are antisocial. They are a strain on society. They necessarily engage in criminal activity. They're a public nuisance in many ways. I felt when I was arrested that the police were doing a necessary job of enforcing the laws of this country, and they were doing what they had to do. But it wasn't until I had access to abstinence-based recovery that I was able to change my behaviour and significantly reduce, all but obliterate, my criminal activity, apart from the occasional skirmish.
Okay, so what we're now going to do is have a look at a short transcript from that video. I'm just going to display it for you here now. And what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes, pause this video, read this through, and see if you can identify any specific words or phrases from this extract from the video that we've just watched that reflects Russell Brand's conceptualization of addiction as illness. I'll give you a moment to do that, and then I will show you some of the answers. Okay, so now that you've had a go at this task, I've highlighted, these are not all of the words and phrases that I think some people would argue also reflect this conceptualization of mapping from the source illness onto this target of trying to talk about and explain and understand and conceptualize addiction. But these are some of the key ones that I would draw out for you. I think the term became is an interesting term, and because of something that happens to you, you get ill, things happen to you, they're not choices that you make. So when we look in a moment at addiction as choice, you don't become things as a result of choice. They are not because of something, they're because of your choice. They're not because of things like emotional difficulties and psychological difficulties. This term malady, a term that literally sort of means illness or sickness. They were the result of a condition. They are symptomatic. Illnesses have symptoms, choices don't. Illnesses are described as conditions, choices aren't. Talking about the need, not the choice, not the desire, not the want, the need to take or use drugs also reflects this conceptualization. Talking about recovery, we recover from illnesses, we don't recover from choices. We can even see this specific, and sometimes you will see the actual underlying conceptual metaphor being used about talking about the disease or illness of addiction. Illnesses are things that you tackle. You don't need to tackle choices, you just can make different ones. Talking about solutions, conditions, recovery. So this would be a really good way, and if you were going to think about doing an analysis like this would be the sort of thing that you would engage in, that you would pull out and talk about how these things reflect this particular conceptualization. And you can also see very clearly that this conceptualization fundamentally underpins Russell Brand's view about what we should therefore do about people who are dealing with addiction. Let's compare that then to this. This is Peter Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens' brother. He writes quite frequently for the Daily Mail. I'm afraid I don't have a video for this one to show you. I'm going to ask you again to do the same exercise. Just pause this video for a moment, have a read through, and see if you can spot him conceptualizing addiction not as an illness, but as a choice. Now, I will just say to you initially that in the first couple of sentences, what he's essentially doing is reiterating Russell Brand's point of view. So it's perhaps in the lower parts of this extract that you want to be looking for this conceptualization of taking features from this source choice and mapping it onto addiction. So if you just pause the video and have a go at it yourself. Okay, so I said to you a moment ago that initially we see Hitchens reiterate Brand's point of view, but reiterating his argument of what he's saying. And here, in this first part of the extract, the bits that I've highlighted in green, and particularly these bits that I have underlined, what you see is him talking about, not invoking, not feeling this way himself, but talking about addiction as an illness by reiterating Russell Brand's point of view. So talking about not being responsible for something and being made to do things are reflective of things that are not choices. We're not responsible for being ill. We are responsible for our choices. Choices are things that we decide to do, not things that we're made to do. So in this first part of the extract, we can see some reflections of this earlier conceptual metaphor, this alternative conceptual metaphor, illness. But as Peter Hitchens moves into talking about his own point of view, what we see is quite an interesting shift linguistically into talking about things that are definitely drawing on this conceptualization of choice, this source, and mapping it onto the idea of addiction. So he talks about it as being a pleasure, something that you seek, instead of where Russell Brand in the first extract talked about need to do things. He talks about people doing things because they want to do things. It comes from rich Western kids selfishly. Selfishness is something which we might associate with choice. We would never characterise somebody as being selfish as a result of having an illness, because we understand that it's something that is outside of their control, following their pleasure, doing things because they are choosing to do so. And also, just if you want to take this a step further, I think this rich Western kids is quite interesting as well, because what this is doing is taking the concept of an addict, so the person who is addicted, and conceptualising them through a source of children. So it's rich Western kids, and we might think about that as well as kids as being more likely to make selfish choices, because we expect them to do that because they're children and they don't know any better, or they don't think compassionately and carefully about how their actions are going to influence others. So an interesting sort of additional layer that we could look at the other conceptual metaphors that are supporting and feeding into this as well. So I'm just going to finish then by talking to you about how conceptualizations of addiction are influenced. And this is based on some fantastic research by a former MA student here at Hallam. Her dissertation thesis, her MA thesis, is available in the Hallam Library and should be available up on the reading list online if you're interested in it. She really pioneered this research about addiction as illness and addiction as choice. But she says this, she says conceptualizations of addiction exist on a continuum and are constantly influenced by embodied experiences. So the encounters that we have, the things that we experience ourselves, are all the things that influence how we conceptualize addiction. So she would argue that if you have ever been addicted to something, you understand that it is not a choice, and it tends to be people who have not got personal or experience or experiences of witnessing people close to them who will tend to conceptualize addiction as a choice. But if you ever have had an experience of addiction, or you have seen it affect a close friend or a family member and watched and observed their behaviours and their actions, that you're more likely to conceptualize addiction as an illness. He says this continuum moves from choice to illness and is dependent upon social norms which are formed by an individual's understanding of whether a person who uses drugs needs them to function. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'll be really interested to talk more to you about this, and if anybody is interested in pursuing this as an avenue for their own research, do get in touch, and I will see you in the live session next week. Thank you very much.